start with a joke. A rabbi and a pastor walk into a writing seminar. I don't know how the rest, but we'll have to find out how the rest of it ends.
It's a great premise.
So, today we have Rabbi Philip Graubart, who's author of 6 novels, including Rabbis and Gangsters, Silwan, and his latest, Here There Is No Why. And you can see, if you see up close, you can see the books over here. He served congregations in Massachusetts and San Diego and worked in leadership positions at the Shalom Hartman Institute, the National Yiddish Book Center, and the San Diego Jewish Academy. And he currently teaches Jewish thought at the Academy for Jewish Religion in California. We also have the Reverend Michael Kinnaman, PhD, who is an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, a professor of theology for 30 years in seminaries and universities in the U.S. and India, and former General Secretary of the National Council of Churches in the USA. He's preached twice at St. Paul's, which has hopefully brought some of you, and has spoke about his book, The Witness of Religion in an Age of Fear, at a forum several years ago. And we did a study of it in conjunction with Or Shalom Synagogue and the Islamic Center around that time. At the time he told us, but since 2019, he's stopped writing theology and focused entirely on fiction. And A Rooftop in Jerusalem, which he'll be talking about today, will be his 3rd novel to be published. And unfortunately, pastor's duties, he has to. Okay, well, he'll tell you, if he leaves early, it's not because he's upset with you. And so we're going to be hearing, as our blurb said, Jerusalem is the spiritual heart of 3 great religions and a place of enduring discord, and it's inspiration for their 2 novels. And so I'll just turn it over to you from now.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Calvin. Since he began by mentioning that, I'll simply mention that I have to leave a little bit early because at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, the pastor of my church called me to say he has COVID. So I was scrambling last night to put together a sermon, and we'll have to leave here in order to be there for a 10:30 worship service. So when I leave, Phil will still be here and able to be signing books of his if you have interest in that. I am Michael Kinnaman, the Reverend in this title of the Rabbi, the Reverend in Jerusalem. I was thinking as we were sitting here that one of these times I should come with a yarmulke and a prayer shawl, and you should come with a clerical collar, and we really mess with them. And in the spirit of Comic-Con.
Yes, the respective costumes.
I want to begin, actually, by giving thanks for the ministry that God has done, is doing, will do through the people of St. Paul Cathedral. I hope you know that you are recognized as a beacon of social justice ministry throughout this city, and people beyond these walls appreciate it very much. Thank you. And I say that based on some personal experience, because as Calvin said, I have preached here twice. The first time was on Pride Sunday, about 9 years ago, I think it was, when I first came to San Diego. And then we did a study of my book, The Witness of Religion in an Age of Fear. So I'm happy to be back, and I'm very pleased to be here with my good friend and a very fine novelist, Rabbi Phil Graubart, who will introduce himself a bit more in a moment. But let me tell you how we came about doing these joint presentations. We realized that we both had written books within the last year that are set in Jerusalem. Phil's book, Here There Is No Why, set in Jerusalem, came out in November, is that right? And my book at the end of May, Rooftop in Jerusalem. But we read each other's manuscripts in advance, and we realized that inadvertently there are a lot of other things that these books have in common. For instance, they both have protagonists, male American protagonists who fall in love with Israeli women. In both of these cases, the protagonists remain outsiders who yet are deeply attached to the place of Jerusalem and surrounding areas. In both of these cases, one Christian protagonist, the other Jewish protagonist, they have an ambivalent relationship, I think it's fair to say, with their own religious tradition. In both of our novels, the plot extends over multiple decades. We have different perspectives, a lot of perspectives, religious, political, cultural, that figure in both of our books, and they're both set in Jerusalem. So we decided that it would be a good idea if we did a joint presentation to talk about some of this together, and that's what led to this. This is the third time that we've appeared together before groups in the city. We have another half dozen planned, including down at Or Shalom later in August, and look forward to more in the future. We think there are a number of good reasons beyond pushing our books to have a rabbi and a minister talk about their fiction that's set in Jerusalem. For one thing, and by the way, since we're in a Christian audience, amens are appropriate if you want on any of these. At a time when books are being banned, when in this country libraries and the national humanities and the arts in general are under attack from this government, we think it is very valuable to lift up the power and importance of literary fiction. Do you agree?
Yes.
Phil will have more to say about this in a moment, the power of literature. Secondly, at a time when news from the Middle East understandably focuses on war and division, we think it's also important to put a human face on the headlines that come out of that part of the world. Jerusalem, for example, is not only a real place, it's a real symbol. It's a symbol of peace and conflict. It's a symbol of holiness and religious division. It's a symbol of hope and disappointment. But beyond that, it's a place where real people live. Inside, many of you have probably been in Jerusalem, inside the walled old city, the wall built in the 16th century, surrounds 1 square kilometer. That's all it is. There are 30 to 35,000 people who live there, carrying on their work, going to school, doing sports. And we hope that we put our face on some of those people to help make this real.
Sure.
Third, at a time when religious tension is increasing around the world, including anti-Semitism, we think it's important for a Jew and a Christian, in this case, to model interfaith friendship. I'll add, by the way, that if you know of a Muslim author who's written a book set in Jerusalem, let us know, because we're happy to expand to a threesome. But at the moment, you have the two of us as we try to model friendship together. One of my books, before I began writing fiction, has a chapter in it in which I offer guidelines for how to talk about difficult issues in Jewish-Christian relations. The number one guideline, and I wrote this chapter, by the way, with my good friend, a rabbi who's head of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. The number one guideline that we offer is know each other as friends. Because friends try to understand when there's conflict. Friends don't assume ulterior motives. Friends assume that when there's a disagreement, it's grounded in important convictions, not simply opinions. Are you with me? You can see the importance of this. We want to model some of that in our own life together, including in talking about our fiction. I'm going to add one other word because it's the elephant in the room if we don't say it. And I want to say it, and then Phil may want to elaborate. Both Rabbi Graubert and I are appalled, sickened at heart by the destruction in Gaza and by the massive loss of life among Palestinians in Gaza, including the more recent humanitarian crisis, which now has finally begun to grip the conscience of the world. So I want to stress that to begin with. At the same time, I want to say, as a Christian, I hope we are also remembering the appalling history of Christian persecution of Jews over the last 2,000 years. That too is a justice issue. I think Phil and I would both say, you may want to nuance all this. In fact, I can't tell whether he's nodding or shaking his head as I say this. We want to say several things at once because these are complicated times and we think we can deal with them with nuance. One of the things we want to say is that we stand in opposition to many policies of the Netanyahu government, including in Gaza. At the same time, we lament and are appalled by the attack on Israelis on October the 7th, including the taking of hostages. We want to say that the rising anti-Semitism that we see around the world needs to be opposed, including by Christians like us. And at the same time, we are appalled by the way this administration uses anti-Semitism as a weapon to suppress free speech. Did I say those right? My good friend Phil Rabbi.
Rod.
I think I'm going to stay seated for a little while. My back is urging me, but that's okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's such a beautiful institution, physically and spiritually. I've actually attended a few light up the night services with my wife, my family. Just wonderful to be here. I'm really pleased that you invited me, so thank you. So you've heard a little bit about me. The bulk of my career has been at synagogues. And the bulk of that is Congregation Bethel in La Jolla, so some of you may have been there too. Very different building, but also a very beautiful building, beautiful institution. And I was there for 20 years, and then I had one other congregation in Massachusetts. I was there for 15 years, something like that. I spent a little time in national Jewish organizations, but mostly it's been at synagogues. And so all that time I was in synagogues, I had a kind of secret identity, which I was a novelist. And so my congregations through the years, whenever a book would come out, and it was 6 novels, it's also 2 story collections too, so I've been writing fiction. They didn't know quite what to do with me. It's a very different persona, at least it was for me, for a pastor, for a rabbi. The general way a rabbi communicates values and ideas to a congregation is through a sermon, a homily, and sermons have to be pointed and not too long, and you come right to the conclusion, and you can walk away from a sermon, hopefully with one sentence. That's what I was taught anyway. You need to be able to summarize your sermon with one sentence. And I try to do that as much as possible. A novel's very different. In a novel, you take deep, complicated ideas. You don't necessarily come to conclusions. The idea is to make you think a little bit, to make you ponder, maybe read a different book. This is very different personas. And for me in the congregations, also they would see me in very different ways that was maybe uncomfortable to them, because I would open up discussions that they would prefer to be closed. Also, sometimes just a character might have a swear word, or there might be a sex scene in the novel, which is very natural for novelists. Even Michael's books, you have some of that. But if it's your pastor that's writing it, you may want to just turn the page really quickly. So I had just very different relationships. It was me, the novelist, and me, the rabbi. It's nice now that I'm able to synthesize those two. I'm not a synagogue rabbi anymore. I've retired from that work. I'm just teach and write now. What I thought about myself that over the years, as I was writing novels and also giving sermons, is that what brings these two practices together is storytelling. And I think every pastor, every minister, anybody that communicates understands the power of storytelling, story. And I'll go into novels just in a second, or fiction, but really it wasn't until close to the end of my career that I realized, oh, that's it. Now I have a label for it, and with the label, I can go forward with a kind of integrated persona, and that is I'm a storyteller. And the thing about novels is I get to make up the story. you don't really do that in the sermon, or maybe you stray a little bit, but a story, it's however you want the characters to act, that's how they're going to act, and whatever depth of thought you want to portray, you can portray. Which leads me to just some thoughts about fiction and the way fiction, I think, succeeds, or potentially can succeed in conveying important sets of truths, or get people thinking. First of all, again, it was a very congenial form for me, because there are so many forces facing just the Jewish world that a sermon, a class, just can't do it justice. But you can do it justice with a novel. I'll give you just a few examples. The relationship between modern Israel, contemporary Israel, and the Holocaust. That's a very important theme in my book. It's not something you can just handle in a sermon or a talk, but it's very important. But I can handle it in the book through characters, and characters relating to each other. Suicide. So Israel's had to face the challenge of suicide bombers, really ever since I visited there in the 1980s. Very complicated and traumatic and difficult topic to study, but you can do it, you can introduce it. You can introduce it into the fabric, the sense of place in Jerusalem. And so I was able to do that. Terrorism, PTSD, war and peace, parenting, all great, big, thought-provoking issues. You can tackle those in fiction, have people discuss them, go back and forth. So that's also important, just it's congenial to me to be able to present really important issues in the Jewish community today, and by extension, just in the human community. The most compelling reason, though, that I like fiction as a model is it forces the novelist, I think the responsible novelist, the good novelist, it forces the novelist to develop a sense of empathy for all sorts of different types of people. In this particular book, and I don't know if this is conscious or not. Consciously, I'm just trying to write a good story with interesting people and interesting situations. But I ended up with a cast of characters that think very differently about the world. And I think a decent representation, although it's not a parliamentary representation, but a deep representation of the splits and the divides in the Jewish community in the world, but mostly in Israel. So I have a classic labor Zionist, one of the founders of Israel, as a character. A war hawk, kind of a right-wing hawk as a character. Religious Zionist. And probably most difficult, where there's a Holocaust survivor. Very difficult to have empathy because you just can't experience what they experienced. And also I have a character who's a suicide bomber, who actually failed as a suicide bomber and is a character in the book. I tease Michael sort of that the one character, one point of view that's missing is I don't have Christians in the book, and I need to have that. Although there is a character, Mary. I specifically named her Mary because I need to have a Christian. And but she dies before the book opens, so I don't give her a big enough role. So I apologize for that. My next book, I want to talk just. So religious Zionists, an important character in the book is a religious Zionist. Going back, I want to present, it's not like it's a debate society in the book. These are just people and they go about their life. But I want to present them as sympathetically as possible to show that it's possible for me to inhabit their point of view, to inhabit their culture and their sensibility, because it's not just about opinions. It's about the life you live and how you're brought up. So this religious Zionist character, my son called me not that long ago. My son is a grown lawyer in New York. And he said, I read your book, which I was simultaneously pleased and nervous about. And they don't, my sons don't necessarily read my books, but he read the book, and he had a complaint, because why else would he call me about it? And he said, his complaint was you draw that religious Zionist so sympathetically. I mean, I understand him. But we don't understand, it's not an ideological position in my life that's comfortable for me. But as a novelist, it's important for me to present characters that people can understand, can sympathize with, or at least get a sense of their background, their longings, their perspectives. 2 more points just about empathy. Difficult to step into the shoes of a Holocaust survivor. That's a debate in literary circles in the Jewish community. Is it really possible to portray the experience of a Holocaust survival in any way, in fiction and nonfiction? And of course the answer to that is no, it's not possible, but that you have to try. And I think that's the novelist's challenge. The novelist says, we are not giving up on that. I won't get to it, I can't, I didn't experience the Holocaust, but I have to develop a sense of empathy so I can present that perspective, because it's the only way we learn and feel and grow. So of course in the book it was a challenge. One of the main characters, the Holocaust survivor. And then I had the suicide bombers. A minor character in the Bible. I'm sorry. Boy, that's a terrible Freudian slip. But I was going to say, yeah. So a minor character in my novel, which is not the Bible, but an important perspective. And I have to say, of all, like novelists, I joke that one of the reasons I became a novelist is that I don't have to do research. I can just make everything up. All my other forms of writing, I have to do research and make sure everything's correct. That's not entirely true, because when you write a novel, you want to get close to the truth, at least the outer trappings of the truth. So I did a lot of research on suicide bombers, even though it's a minor character, it shows up like in a page or two, but I wanted to understand. I wanted to get it right, but I also wanted to understand. And I feel like if I tell myself that I succeeded at all in the book, it's in presenting these characters, having all the forces of the world, all the forces, sometimes toxic, traumatic forces that face the people that live in that territory, in Israel and mostly Jerusalem, have them face it and understand what the trauma does to them, what the forces do to them, how they come out of those experiences. All right, I think that's fiction. So,
Two quick comments in response to what Phil just said. This is fun because we get to play off each other, and even though we've done this before, we don't necessarily say the same things. You may know the name of Yossi Klein Halevi. He's a well-known Jewish spiritual commentator, political commentator. He's a friend of mine. And he read an early copy, in fact he writes the blurb that's on the cover of A Rooftop in Jerusalem. And he said to me, I just don't like your perspective in the book. Well, how would you know my perspective in the book? The characters don't necessarily represent me. Just as Phil was saying, these are characters who grow out of our imagination. I'll add in a moment, I'll tell you that some of what I have written in A Rooftop in Jerusalem is based on my own experience. But in my experience as a novelist, the more you remember rather than imagine, the worse it is. That imagination shapes experience into deeper truth, and it is more important, I think, now to realize that and to attempt to imagine rather than simply to remember something from the past. I think the other comment came from, I was at a church assembly this last week because one of my novels, The Nominee, comes out of my own church experience, and so I was there pushing this novel this last week. And one of my former students came up to me and said, so you used to write theology and now you write fiction. How can you tell the difference? Now, so there is that also. In a moment, we're going to both read briefly from these books because we think that'll give you a feel for what we've been saying more abstractly. But before I read a bit from Rooftop in Jerusalem, I want to tell you a bit more about my own personal background that gave rise to some of this experience.
Sure.
I studied at the Tel Aviv University in 1969 and 1970. But I spent many weekends, almost the majority, I sometimes think, in Jerusalem, and especially staying at a very cheap Palestinian hotel inside the Old City. This is so interesting because Phil and I have said we experienced Jerusalem very differently. Jewish students weren't at all anxious to get inside the Old City where I took. That was the place where I went. Living in this hotel, which, by the way, the rooms would sleep about 7 men to a room, and it cost, I think, under $1 a night to stay there. So inexpensive. And I was staying in the Old City, in this Al-Kamal Hotel, when the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the great Al-Aqsa Mosque, third holiest site in all of Islam, was set on fire by a Christian zealot from Australia. This was in 1969. This was, in the Muslim world, the equivalent of the burning of Notre Dame. A really major event, and it is the opening scene in a rooftop in Jerusalem, and serves as a kind of Rorschach test as people respond to this event throughout the novel. My wife and I then lived in Tel Aviv in 1972. This was 69, 70. I was a student, lived there in 1972, and we were most recently back there together in March of 2020 as the country shut down around us because of COVID.
Okay.
In between, I've been back to Israel a number of times, leading various groups, I don't know, 25 times, something like this. And really all of this culminated when I was the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. You may know that some of my work there was done in relationship to the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, with whom I worked to get family unification permits for Palestinians, building permits for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, open checkpoints during holidays, and so on. On the other hand, the National Council, many of our member churches have deep roots in Palestinian areas. The largest church in the West Bank is the Greek Orthodox, which is also a central member of the National Council of Churches, which includes Syrian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and Anglicans. As you know, there is a great cathedral, St. George's Cathedral, which is just not too far outside the Damascus Gate of the Old City in Jerusalem. So lots of experience there with Palestinian leaders and regular folks, as well as having studied and lived in Israel. This has given me, I hope, a perspective to try and see various sides of this conflict. A Rooftop in Jerusalem is a love story between an American Christian named Daniel and an Israeli Jew named Shoshana, that's set against the backdrop of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This love story ebbs and flows over 40 years, and in fact, I've tried to write it so that the ebb and flow of the love story parallels subtly the ebb and flow of the peace process that, of course, doesn't look very promising at the moment. This story, the novel is divided into 5 major sections. Times when Daniel spends prolonged time back in Jerusalem. And each one opens with a dramatic incident like the burning of Al-Aqsa, or with a poignant incident that Daniel participates in. And then the subsequent chapters fill in the background, including his encounters with Shoshana. I'm going to read briefly from the beginning of the 4th section. This opening vignette culminates when Daniel, who's leading a student group, encounters or is confronted by Israeli soldiers on Shuhada Street in the old city of Hebron, south of Jerusalem. I'm going to read 2 pages right before that because they indicate what I try to do in showing multiple perspectives. As their bus skirted Bethlehem on the way to Hebron, Daniel, not the guide, gave a short introduction to the tomb of the patriarchs. We'll visit both the area where Jews are allowed to pray and the mosque, he told the 16 students, ranging in age from Jen, who was 22, to Julia, one of several second career students who was 60. On the way there, we'll walk through a market that has netting above it to catch garbage dumped by Israeli settlers from their apartments. When I was here with an interfaith group, I even saw the guide, Yaniv, had swiveled around in his seat at the front of the bus and now cut in. The settlers can be a problem, that is true, but they've also been threatened. You need to hear the two sides of the story and not exaggerations. I've heard people say that the trash, some of it, is put there to make Jews look like they're bad. Daniel could see Caleb biting his tongue, and several of the students were shaking their heads, particularly Ian, who had been to Israel before and knew more than the rest of the group about the region. The visit to the tomb went smoothly, although Daniel noticed several of the students wandered off whenever Yaniv began his explanations. But when they gathered afterward, standing in front of the mosque, Ian said, "Baruch Goldstein." He was looking directly at Yaniv. "Were you going to mention him or just pretend it didn't happen?" He turned to the other students. "Goldstein was a zealot who about 10 years ago burst in here with his army assault rifle and killed, I think it was 30 Muslims praying in the mosque. Wounded 100 more, right here." I showed Andrea the bullet holes. The guide glared at Ian. "I was going to tell about that." He paused. "Since you know so much about history, you must know about the massacre of Jews here in Hebron in 1929. Someone started telling lies about Jews taking over Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and that was the excuse for killing, for raping women. They burned people alive. Hebron was a town where Jews lived during all the years of exile, but an Arab mob destroyed the houses and the Abraham synagogue. 500 years it was here, and they made it a place for donkeys and goats." Ian shook his head. "I'm talking about something that just happened, 10 years ago, and you bring up something from a whole different era as if that justifies anything. Jews are killing Palestinians every day right now." "Be accurate," said Daniel. "Some members of the Israeli military and a few extremist settlers have at times killed Palestinians. And Israelis too have been killed in this intifada." "Thank you," said Yaniv. Caleb started to speak, but the guide wasn't finished. "You talk about what's happening now," looking at Ian, "but have you ever seen what it's like after a terrorist blows himself up in the middle of other people?" "I have. I was there when a terrorist, a woman terrorist that time, blew up a bus in Jerusalem. Pieces of bodies here and there all over the street. A leg was ripped off and laying there in front of me. Sometimes I hear a person screaming and screaming. You wash and wash and wash, and still it's like you have blood and little pieces of flesh all over you, in your hair, on your clothes." He stopped and then said in a softer voice, "There's an organization called Tzaka, Orthodox Jews that pick up these pieces of body. They look for them down on their knees all over the streets, scrape them off walls and put them in sacks so at least something, even the smallest part, even a fingernail, can be buried." The wind was picking up the sky a January gray as the group stood somber and silent. "We should get back to the bus," Daniel thought. It was 3:30 and it had already been a tiring day. Besides, he was hoping to see Shoshana. On the other hand, wasn't this the kind of dialogue he hoped for as a professor? Wasn't this what learning really happened? Julia broke the silence, almost in a whisper. "Do they only do this for Jews?" "How could they do that? Who can tell if a foot or an ear belongs to a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian?" "Yes, some of the settlers, we should say it, are crazy in the head. And Goldstein was a murderer. Yimach Shemo, may his name be forgotten. But most Israelis don't want all this death and violence. Who would want this?" He looked around the semicircle of students. "This barrier you don't like that Israel's building, who can like it? But we need to stop the bombings." Yaniv shook his head several times, his expression a cross between anger and sorrow. "I did not know anyone on that bus in Jerusalem, Alechem HaShalom, but a friend, a very good friend, was killed in a bombing in the market in Netanya. She," his voice cracked and he paused, "she and I, we sometimes argued because she was a big supporter of Palestinians, and she's the one killed." it makes everyone afraid. And then things are very dangerous.
Thank you for reading that. It gets to me every time. I was thinking you were mentioning Yossi Klein Halevi and that the perspective made him uncomfortable, or I don't agree, I can't remember exactly what he said, but this is, I think, what's happened with Michael and I, and I'll agree that we become friends, and that friendship really has motorized our discussions here. It's, very important to me. I will say, though, also that one of the ways we communicate with each other is through manuscripts. I learned so much about Michael's perspective from his manuscripts, what really makes him tick, his soul. And I hope I communicate the same way. But I'll say that part that you've read, it makes me uncomfortable too. But I have to say that's good. I mean, there's times in our life where we need to be made uncomfortable. And I feel like we're among friends here. I can admit a few things. I was talking to Michael before we came for the event about the horrible hunger crisis now in Gaza. And I was telling Michael, I have several friends in Israel. Most Jews, by the way, more than 50% of American Jews have either close friends or family in Israel. So it's always about family. So many of my friends in Israel, now I'm going to say something that maybe sounds shocking, but it's true, and it gives you an interesting perspective. What they've told me is this is the first time they've really paid attention to Gaza. And I want to yell back at them, what do you mean, it's the first time you paid attention? I mean, it's been rubble for a long time. And they say, yes, this is the first time. It's the first time they could come out of their own trauma from October 7th. So, of course, it's making them uncomfortable. Just for me, any description of the market of Rome, where the Jewish settlers kind of hold sway, that makes me very uncomfortable as a Jew, but it's important. I invite that discomfort, because otherwise there's a serious part of the conflict I'm missing. And so I don't really want to go into detail about this, but I understand the perspective of my friends who live in Israel, just having their eyes open right now. It takes a while. And trauma goes on different paths. Okay, I'm going to put that out there. My book, And Here There Is No Why, it's a mystery. And I feel like I've painted it so far as this really heavy book. I suppose it does tackle heavy themes. There's lighthearted moments, and it's also kind of fun, just as a mystery. So there's a central Holocaust survivor who's also a famous writer, lives in Israel, born in Poland, lives in Israel, and dies mysteriously. This is in the early 1980s. And the question the book tries to answer, the mystery of the book is, how did he die? Chaim, how did he die? And Chaim has a student in the 1980s, and coincidentally, I was a student in Israel in the early 1980s. Doesn't mean the character's me, but there's some similarity. And so he's close to the character, becomes his most favorite student. And then something like 25 years later, in 2005, during the Second Intifada, this same character, who was a student, comes to Israel as a reporter to investigate, once and for all, okay, how did this person die? So that's the book. The Here There Is No Why, maybe I'll explain that real quickly. So some of you may have heard of the writer Primo Levi. I stole the title from a saying from Primo Levi. So Primo Levi very briefly said, he recounts this episode when he first got to Auschwitz. And he says the experience of being in the trains, the most dramatic hardship was thirst. That was at least his experience. So they've just gotten to the barracks in Auschwitz, and he feels like literally he's dying of thirst. So it's winter, so there's an icicle outside the window, so he grabs the icicle and starts sucking on it. And the SS guard immediately sees he's sucking on the icicle and knocks it out of his hand and smashes it with his boot. And Primo Levi, not understanding what he's gotten into yet, looks at the guard and says, why? Warum in German, it's why. And the guard says, here there is no why. So it's a cry of kind of existential despair, and yet at the same time, looking for a sense of why. Is there a why? Is there some why that can guide us through this world? Okay. What I'm going to read now.
You're right. That's a super preach.
So I got to go preach. So I may have been preaching already. But so Phil is going to read, and then I've left some of my books over here in case any of you want to purchase one of those. I'm going to come back and promise to sign them later in August, if that works, or order it online, and I'll come back anyway in August and see if that will work to sign some books. But Phil will be here to answer questions and has all the books for us. So I'm going to excuse myself. Thanks for inviting us.
I think some of us maybe would prefer to hear your sermon. All right, so the bit I'm going to read now is part of my book, just like Michael told us, it was a love story. And what he didn't say, but I think you'd agree with, is that it's also a love story about Jerusalem. It's about how two characters fell in love with Jerusalem. And the romance, I think, that's central to the novel is a metaphor for our own love affair with this city, this beautiful and tragic city. So I'm going to read a section that shows it just part of what I love about Jerusalem, the diversity. And I'll read it first and then kind of explain what I'm trying to get at there. So in the story, there's this love story. The young man is in his early 20s, falls in love, gradually begins dating and falls in love with an Israeli woman. And she, this is their second or third date, she invites him to go to dinner at Chaim's house. Chaim is the Holocaust survivor who is also a professor. He's invited both of them to Friday night dinner, so they go together. And she comes and picks up, his name is Judah, she comes and picks up Judah in her bicycle. One thing you have to it's not so important that you know, but I'll just share that bicycles in Jerusalem were very unusual in the early 1980s. Hardly anybody had a bicycle. It's a hard city to ride a bicycle because there's so many hills. Now, because of e-bikes, Jerusalem was crowded with bicycles, but then it was unusual. All right, I'll just read that. She told me to meet her right outside my dorm building at 6 p.m. I wore my one white shirt, my one pair of black dress pants, and sandals, which seemed slightly more Sabbath appropriate than sneakers. I remembered to buy a bottle of wine right before the grocery stores on Mount Scopus closed up for Shabbat. I held it in a plastic bag. The twilight hour was cool, quiet, and fragrant with pine. Not yet jacket weather, but coming on that season. Late September, past the Jewish holidays. Autumn in Jerusalem. I shouldn't have been, but I was shocked to see Michal pedaling uphill. She reached my building and hopped off, smiling. She wore a flower-patterned dress, light blue with yellow daisies, and a black helmet. Maybe a touch of lipstick, though I wasn't yet at the point where I could discern subtle makeup. I didn't see a bike lot. You're going to leave the bike here? Come on, we can take it up to my room. She laughed. Hop on, she said. This time I held on to her, not the seat. I shoved the wine bag on my shoulder and wrapped both my arms around Michal's torso. I had to caution myself not to squeeze too tightly. The problem wasn't lust, it was fear. We headed downhill from Mount Scopus, and Michal never stopped pumping the pedals, as if she didn't trust gravity to move us forward. She screamed and pointed at various oddly shaped towers, probably mosques, as we leveled off to Wadi Joe's, the neighboring Arab neighborhood that separated the university from the Jewish neighborhoods near the old city. I realized she was playing tour guide, pointing at the sights, but I couldn't hear her clearly through the wind, and I nearly panicked each time she took one hand off her handlebars. Just past a strip of auto repair shops, she cut sharply right into an alley. The pavement quickly turned to dirt, and dust blew in my face like a horde of locusts. I had to shut my eyes so I felt like, but didn't see the next sudden left, where I nearly toppled off the bike, taking Michal with me in my tight grip. But she leaned forward, yanking me back onto the seat. Then 30 terrifying seconds later, she screeched to a halt. She slowly removed my arms from around her waist as if unbuckling the seatbelt, and then hopped off. She swept off her black helmet and grinned. Fun, huh? We have to walk now. They don't like you riding on the street on Shabbat. She pushed the bike through a whitewashed arch separating the alley from a different neighborhood. Geula, as I would discover, an almost exclusively religious enclave. Stepping through the arch vaulted us into a different world. The street was crowded with black and white garbed men, hurrying to shul. Young, headscarf mothers, many of them pregnant and pushing strollers, and smartly dressed children, the boys twirling their twisted earlocks, the girls holding hands. I was surprised that I drew most of the stares. After all, I was wearing an yarmulke, a present from my mother, and, while missing a Steinwell coat and beard, I was dressed in black and white, with full-length pants and a long-sleeve shirt. Surely a short-sleeved clad female cyclist was more of an oddity in this neighborhood than an appropriately dressed tourist carrying a bottle of sweet Shabbat wine. But when she greeted them all with a smile and a good Shabbos, I realized they knew her. Her 10-speed was part of the neighborhood. I was the stranger. So I like this. I mean, I sort of like the lightheartedness. So it's just right. I just also want to show just the incredible diversity of Jerusalem. He starts this on this gleaming at the time, very modern, just kind of big rebuilt, Scopus, one of the most modern buildings in the Middle East. Then they go through an Arab village, Wadi Joz. So Wadi Joz is famous for two things. One is that it's sort of the anti-intellectual village. It identifies itself as anti-intellectual as opposed to the gleaming intellectual focus of Mount Scopus. But it's also a place where if you need to get your car fixed, that's where you come and get your car fixed. I owned a motorbike in those days when I was living in Jerusalem, and if I needed to park, I would go to Wadi Joz. That doesn't happen anymore because the populations are too opposed to each other, and it's dangerous. Michael mentioned how in the early 1980s, I never would have thought for a moment of staying in a hotel in the Muslim part of the old city. They just would have told me, forget it. I mean, it wasn't in our consciousness. If we were going to stay in the old city, we were going to stay in the Jewish quarter. That's how Wadi Joz is right now, too. I mean, they're still fixing cars, but Jews are afraid to go, and they're not going to go. But back then, that's where you went. Right after Wadi Joz, basically in the Arab village, you go through an arch, and you're like in 19th century Jewish Poland. But it's just like that. That's true. Jerusalem has that profound diversity, recognizing different types of upbringings and sensibilities.
So let's see if
you have time for one more short passage? This also takes place in Jerusalem. So beyond, and in some ways accompanying the beauty of Jerusalem, is a constant set of tensions. And it's not just because of October 7th, it's because as the capital of Israel, Jerusalem has experienced bombings, suicide bombings, all through its history. And even though you walk through the city and you live your life, it does a number on you. The trauma in some ways is always there. There's a nervousness that's always there. So I tried to recount that a bit in this passage. This is just, it's a learning session. They're studying Jewish mysticism. And it's a group of people, I don't know if anybody's been to the Kotel, the wall, but there's a tunnel on the left side of the wall as you're facing it, where it's just an institution, or if you don't want to go outside or you're afraid of the sun. And there are also all sorts of courses that are being taught there. So this takes place, one of the courses is being taught there. We sat still. The quiet in the room allowed the outside noise to penetrate. Male voices, chanting, cantilating, melodic mumbling, davening. 22 years ago, this Kotel tunnel was largely empty, especially mid-morning on a weekday. But now, it was evidently prayers 24/7. Strangely, as if to amplify my thoughts about Jerusalem's growing spirituality, the chanting seemed to rise in volume, as if someone was slowly turning a knob. Just when I felt I might reach a dangerous volume, all the prayerful noises were, in a flash, replaced by 3 quick, extraordinarily loud blasts, explosions, then screams, anguish and beseeching, then sirens, blaring from just a few feet away, and also from a distance, doppling toward us. Then smoke, first the smell, then the stuff itself, thin like a wispy cloud, seeping through the door crack, but darkening, growing, ominous, as if it were leaking from hell. Charlie grabbed his phone, glanced at me quickly, and rushed out. I looked at Rabbi Kaplanitz. He sat up straight, frowned, and shook his head, but he seemed remarkably calm considering the screaming that by now was louder than the previous prayers, and the dark gray thickening smoke slowly filled his private office. This holy land, he said in lament, master of the universe, this holy land. Right. Just the sense also, just the nervousness that accompanies you as you walk the streets of Jerusalem, a scene of normal life, a market, a class, women just taking their children to school, in any moment, possibility of an explosion. And then even when the explosion happens, you sit and just kind of strengthen yourself a while you move on with your life. So I tried to capture that sense of Jerusalem, which is all over Israel. It's not exclusive to Jerusalem. Many parts of this world unfortunately experience that. But there is a way that Jerusalem experiences it that I tried to convey in the book. So I'm happy to take any questions. We have some books if you'd like to purchase or look through the books.
Any questions? Any questions?
Any comments?
Yeah, question.
Just wanted to know if you ever read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Did you read that one?
Yeah, it's a very important book for me. I read it as a teenager, then I go back to it every year. So yeah.
Is he still alive? That guy?
No, they died a while ago.
Okay, thank you. It was a good book. I read it. It's good.
Yeah. Viktor Frankl and Primo Levi. So I based the Chaim character on a writer named Primo Levi, who died also in mysterious ways, but probably took his own life. But Viktor Frankl and Primo Levi have a lot in common. Important writers that ended up producing incredible material out of the ashes of the Holocaust.
Okay, thank you. So,
Oh, thank you for your presentation. I'm intrigued by the second kind of work. I just hope to know clerical errors, so to speak. But seriously, I wonder how it's been received by various Jewish and Muslim communities.
Yeah, I can't really speak to Muslim communities, and like as Michael said, that's a flaw we have in our presentation. We really do need a Muslim perspective. I tried to get that a little bit in the book. There are some Muslim characters. My previous book about Jerusalem is called Silwan. So Silwan is an Arab neighborhood in Jerusalem, and one of the main characters is a Palestinian Arab, based on a character that I got to know and still know. What was the, I'm sorry, I just drew a blank. What was the second part of your question?
How's it received by...
Oh, how's it been received? Okay, yeah, interesting. So,
Yeah.
so after I write a book and it gets noticed in the Jewish community, my first sense is always panic. Like, oh no, I said something wrong. I guess I still in some ways have the pastor, synagogue rabbi mentality where I'm always afraid to say something wrong. And here's something interesting that's happened. So I am, one of the characters in the book is a teenage girl who is the daughter of the main character, the narrator, Judah. And she sits on it, and I'm fascinated by, I'm sorry, I'm drawing out the question a little bit more, but I'm fascinated by father-daughter relationships. Probably because I don't have any daughters, so I never got to experience that. But I think it's been very interesting to me. So I have scenes in the book of a father and daughter. And in general, she's 15, so there's already difficulty in communication. They only really have their significant conversations when they're on long airplane rides together. So on this long airplane ride, he takes her along with him to Israel to try to solve this murder. And she tells him, I need to tell you something. I never told you before, but I'm anti-Zionist. I'm an anti-Zionist. And she goes on to say why she's an anti-Zionist. Now, for me, for the book, she's just trying to needle him. You know, he's a Zionist, and she's 15 years old, and she's just trying to get under his skin. So that's why she's doing it. But in several places in the Jewish community, I've been asked, hey, why would you have a character who's an anti-Zionist? And you know, I have to say that, you know, I want you to try to understand the novelistic process. I'm not giving across my political point of view in this book. It made sense for me that character should be an anti-Zionist. So that doesn't mean I'm an anti-Zionist. I'm not telling you what I am and what I'm not. But it does make sense to me that character. But just to show you the sensitivity in the Jewish community, you know, with the war, with anti-Semitism, there are many people that are approached with that. Their problem with the book is this character who's an anti-Zionist. You know, if you have a problem with a 15-year-old, you know, who's trying to argue with their father and kind of get a rise out of her father, well, people won't have an argument with that. But in the Jewish community, even the term anti-Zionist can create some sensitivities. And Michael and I have talked about that before, which is, I think, why it's so important for us to have this dialogue, and there has to be an internal Jewish dialogue too. In some ways, as important, maybe more important.
The rise in anti-Semitism. Talk about that it just seems to be untethered to the actual situation.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I can give a quick story to demonstrate kind of my own thoughts about it. Just walking into this church, it's a beautiful place, beautiful institution. I'm still, and Michael and I have talked to other churches before too, so I've been to churches before. But walking in today, the fact that I can just open a door, that I encounter an unlocked door, and I can walk in unaccompanied. There's no synagogue in America where you can do that. The bigger synagogues would have outside gates before you get to the next gate, before you get to the next gate. The synagogue where I was associated with for 20 years, and I still go to worship services there. Now, to get in, and this is just for a normal Friday night, Saturday morning service, you go, first you have to be wanded, then you have to be buzzed. This is every congregant. You have to be wanded, then you have to be buzzed in. The security guard, who is armed, and noticeably armed, will walk you up the steps. Now imagine like the service starts at 9:30, and you get there at 9:25. You're not going to make it in time because it takes 10-15 minutes. Just the texture of American Judaism. Now, thank God there haven't been that many attacks, but there's been some. But the texture of American Judaism has changed in discernible ways because our institutions now are so security conscious that we can't ignore it. And then, I have grown children, but imagine taking my 4-year-old to services with me because that's a family thing to do. And you have to first wand Dad, and then we see the man that's noticeably armed. So it's beyond the fact of anti-Jewish violence. You have an atmosphere, and the atmosphere will create a response, a trauma response, which won't be healthy. And it's one of the saddest things in the world for me. Now, there's deeper ways I could go with your question. What is the relationship? Is there a relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? I'm not going into it right now. Someone wants to hear that, I can tell you what I think. But what I want to focus on now, as a novelist, is the changing texture of American Judaism, mirrored somewhat by the texture of Israeli Judaism, also formed under threat. Anything that's formed under threat will have consequences.
Yes, Jeff.
When I was a graduate student back in the 70s, was at a in the university back east, I had to teach class on the Holocaust, and 90% of my students were Jewish who were from families that had basically pushed the Holocaust into the past, but I still had to deal with them. And one of the things I used was Lena Wertmüller's film Seven Beauties. Yeah, which is about this sort of rakish Italian who ends up in a concentration camp with the Germans. But it basically, there are several, what it brought out was what you're talking about, which is several points of view of what the Holocaust was actually doing to people, to both the Jews, the Italians, to Germans, to everyone else. But I found that very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, I mean, maybe you've encountered this before, you've studied this before, but the general narrative, and I say narrative because it's not necessarily accurate, but it's kind of where people have come to, is that the Holocaust was mostly ignored in America and in Israel in the 1950s, 1960s, most of the 1970s. Then, and people wonder exactly why the generation of Holocaust survivors was either dying out or coming on its own. In the late 1970s and through the 80s, suddenly there was an explosion of interest in the Holocaust, both in the United States and in Israel. And in the book, so there's different timelines in the book. I would say the central timeline is 1981, 1982. Two things are happening in Israel, 1981, 1982. One is the first Lebanon War, which I can talk about some other time if you'd like. but also it's the consciousness of the Holocaust is beginning and asserting its power. Some of that has to do with, maybe most of it has to do with the election of Menachem Begin. So Menachem Begin was a European Holocaust survivor. You can quibble with that term Holocaust survivor. He didn't actually survive the Nazis, he survived the Soviets, but he went through the tortures of Jewish experience in Europe in World War II. He becomes prime minister. Before that, all the prime ministers had been native Israelis, and brought up from the soil of Israel. He was brought up from the soil of anti-Semitic Europe, and changed the dynamic, the perspective to this day. So as we go through the 80s and 90s and now, the Holocaust, it's not just that it's become part of the texture and the sensibility of Jewish life. Maybe we've almost overcompensated and we reach for it all the time. And you expect it maybe somehow to fade away, but it doesn't fade away. A lot of that probably is the state of perpetual conflict, and it's just so easy to slot in, we have an enemy. Our old enemy tried to destroy us, the Nazis. This enemy must be trying to destroy us, so this enemy is also a Nazi. And that's easy to do and probably overdone. And yet, we still have to study the Holocaust. We still have to understand the roots of the violence in today's Israel and Palestine.
So, okay, so if there's still further questions, I think we should probably wrap this up. But I want to say, Nick. We did have a discussion in the committee about, the forum shouldn't be just a place for people to hawk their books. And what you've done, but what I want to say, what you and Michael have done is to do exactly what literature should do, is to help us process, life, traumas, and so forth. It's wonderful, really wonderful to sort of see that in action. I saw it myself, and I think for all of us that this is what it's helping us to have. Is to, like you said, give us different points of view. Think about how we do this.
It's totally my pleasure. It's really great to see everybody.
Next week will be Sarah Hankin from Uptown Ministries.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very good.